Okay, everybody, welcome. Whew. I'm so excited to be chatting with you guys today. Welcome to my weekly The Upside Amp audio room. I'm pretty excited. Today we have a very special guest coming to join us. We also will have Fishman calling in a second. You guys know Fish. But today, I'm so excited for this conversation because we have Earth Day coming up this Friday, and I myself, along with the rest of the world, I think we all keep hearing messages over and over again of that we have to protect our planet. We have to find ways to basically, unravel some of the things we're doing that are destroying the planet. And it's something that, I'm not gonna lie, sometimes it keeps me up at night a little bit as I think about all these things. They are such huge topics, and it can be really intimidating to try to think about how to approach these. And so I'm so excited that we have an expert coming on today, Leah Thomas, and she's going to be walking us through her expertise, but also talking about how these environmental issues go hand in hand with social justice. And so I found that fascinating, and I was really excited to hear from her how these two topics overlap. So first I'm going to bring in Fish to the conversation, and then in just a second we'll bring in Leah. So as soon as Fish is here, start chatting away. By the way, thanks everyone for joining. I see we've got 21 people here. Also, if you want, we have more people listening through the Discord. And so if you guys want to comment and chat, we have a Discord channel where this is playing as well, but also it allows you to write feedback and comments. Let's see. Fish, can you hear me?
I can hear you. Yeah, sorry about that. I had a hard time getting my AirPods to work. Didn't want you to.
Darn technology, I tell ya. The bane of my existence. Well, this is the first time that Fish and I aren't sitting next to each other. Usually we're doing this together. Last week we did it from Nashville. We usually do it from LA. And this week I am in Missouri and Fish is in LA. So anyways,
yeah, it feels weird. It feels weird not sitting next to you, but
snacking on something that just feels like that's what we should be doing. Well, I know that today's topic is something. Water? Yeah, usually you're the one that's like, you have your food. Are you comfortable? You put your socks on, Lindsay, like making sure I'm we'll put together. But I think this is something that you are probably really excited for this conversation because you are so involved into like this entire topic of both social justice and environmental issues. So this is gonna be great.
I'm excited. I'm excited to hear, what both of you guys have to say, and just excited for this conversation. Yeah.
Yeah, well, with no further ado, I think I'm going to bring Leah in because I know that she is a very busy person and she's waiting in the green room, waiting for me to bring her in. So I want to just give a little bio on her so you guys know how amazing she is and what to expect. She is a celebrated environmentalist based in Santa Barbara. She coined the term eco-communicator to describe her style of environmental activism. Leah uses her passion for writing and creativity to explore and advocate for the critical yet often overlooked between social justice and environmentalism. And I think that's so cool. Like I said, I'm really excited to learn. I actually read her entire book, so I kind of have an idea, and now I'm like, oh, I get it. But when I first heard those two things being a crossover, I was like, interesting. I was very curious. So she coined the term intersectional environmentalist in 2020. And I think that is where things really exploded for her. So I'm going to bring in Leah right now to join the conversation. So here, any second now she should come in. But yeah, she is incredibly well-versed. She graduated from Chapman University in 2017, worked for several national parks, and wrote freelance for several eco-friendly companies, everything from cleaning products to fashion to food. So let's see, if you unmute yourself, Leah, there you go. How are you doing?
Hi, I'm good. How are you? Thank you so much for having me.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. Thanks for chatting with us today. Especially around Earth Day. I think it's a perfect time to be having these. I mean, it's always a perfect time to be having these conversations, but right now is a time when I think people are kind of tuned into that mindset. So, thanks for joining us. And how are you? Where are you calling from?
I'm good. So I'm actually calling in from New York, but I'll be in St. Louis, which is my hometown, on Friday. And I hear you're in Missouri. That's awesome.
Oh my gosh, I'm like right outside of St. Louis. My sister lives here. And so all week long, I've been playing babysitter while she and her husband went on an anniversary trip. But it is beautiful here. Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Like there's so many trees and I just feel like I'm kind of like, I don't know, I'm surrounded by nature. I'm on a farm right now. It's gorgeous.
That's awesome.
Well, okay. So first of all, I'm just curious, what inspired you to study environmental science and policy?
So I've always really loved plants and animals and just kind of running around in nature in Missouri. And I just thought it was so cool that there was actually a field of study where I could do all of those things. And then, to be completely honest, I wanted to be a communications major, but my parents are really traditional. So my mom was like, you have to study science. So I found a way to do it by studying environmental science and then writing and communicating about environmental science. So that's what led me to it, kind of accidentally. And then I just really fell in love with it.
I love that. And I think honestly, sometimes, I don't know, the best skill sets come from when you combine different passions together, like the fact that you love communications and yet you studied, science and environmental policy and all of this. It kind of allowed you to take, the things you learned, but then have a way to get them to the masses. And we'll talk about this in a second, but I think what's given you such like a voice in this community is that you can make things palatable. You can make things understandable for, for the masses, where a lot of times these topics are so heavy that people don't know what to do with them. So it's really cool that you've been able to combine all these things. But while you were in school studying, you also were in quite a few social justice clubs. And, you participated in social justice events. And I'm curious, did you feel a bit torn at first where you should invest your time and kind of like, oh, how can I be involved with social justice if I'm involved with being an environmentalist? Did you feel that pull a little bit?
I did. I think so. When I was in college and when I was studying environmental science, there were kind of two things that were happening. So there was the Women's March that was going on. So I really wanted to get involved with that. And then there was also a lot of conversations about racial justice, especially after the aftermath of Ferguson, which was really, really close to home for me. So I wanted to be really involved with social justice and women's rights movements, and I wanted to combine environmentalism into all of that. And at times it felt really complicated because people didn't always understand the links. So I kind of set out on a quest to figure out how I could do all of those things and let people know that these things are all connected, because environmental justice also talks about like maternal health and the way our environment is impacting women. And it also addresses how Black and Brown and low income communities are the most impacted by environmental hazards. And I think early on, I saw that was something that was very confusing to a lot of people, understandably, because a lot of the data isn't talked about in really accessible ways. So that's when I kind of got a hunch that maybe this is something that I wanted to do, finding ways to make this information more accessible and understandable so people would know that social and environmental justice are not separate.
Yeah. Okay. So I think that's really fascinating, because I can totally imagine why that would be really overwhelming when you're like, well, I'm a woman, so I want to stand for women's rights. Oh, I also want to stand for the rights of my community and my race. But oh my gosh, this is what I'm studying in school and the world needs help, like, to be saved. Like, that's a lot of different things. And it would suddenly feel like I can't be pulled in a million different directions. But I think it's really neat that you found a way to make them all fit together. And like I was saying before I brought you on, when I first started reading your book, I didn't quite understand how they would all mesh together. But then by the end, all the pieces came together, and it's like, yeah, this is one giant issue. It's not 10 different issues. And you talk a lot about like, how can you respect the planet and the life of everything from plants to the earth if you don't respect the people on it, and if you don't have equal respect for just all living things. Like the concept goes hand in hand. And also I like that you said in your book that you don't have to ignore or forget a part of yourself in order to invest in another part of yourself, because we're all made up of so many different parts. I thought that was a really, really nice way to say it. And it's actually something that me and Fish talked about last week when we were doing a book review. So I was like, oh my gosh, this was, totally different topic, but still a very, very current and very like relatable thing. I'm curious, were there any specific experiences that sparked in you this link between social justice activism and environmentalism?
I would say it's kind of random, but I remember I went to a protest for endangered salmon right before the pandemic, and I was taking it to the streets, for the salmon and to save the fish, and it was so important. And then I remember shortly after, there were a lot of like social justice movements that were happening in 2020. And kind of the same environmentalists that got it and were marching in the streets with me for endangered salmon had this disconnect of like, oh, well, racial justice, that's kind of like outside of the scope of environmentalism. And I think I realized that I committed myself to protesting for the smallest of organisms and even talking about, needing green spaces in certain areas. But some people in the environmental community didn't understand why we should also advocate for endangered humans. And with years of that, like being a park ranger or working at Patagonia, et cetera, and all these spaces, I couldn't do it anymore. I don't know. I love salmon, but it was something about that disconnect that in my mind made me realize, I can't do this. I am not going to be an environmentalist if people are not also advocating for indigenous peoples, for the communities that are being impacted the most by poor air quality, poor water quality, etc., because that doesn't really stand for justice for me, because I'm more than just an animal rights activist, and that's not all that environmentalism is. So I think it was shortly after that protest and realizing that some of those people weren't also standing up for people, and it was a really kind of painful realization, I would say.
And as you shared this with people, like, did they relate? Like, did they seem to see the connection as you started to share these opinions?
It depends. So I think really early on, some people would say things that were dismissive, like, oh, well, we're just really focusing on saving the future. Like, there are racial justice advocates that are doing this work. And honestly, at the time, I felt really meek and really shy. And I thought, okay, if everyone at these prominent environmental organizations is not prioritizing this, then maybe it is just me. Like, I was kind of blaming myself for a long time. But over time, the more I started to explain it just very plainly and bluntly, like, I think that everyone should have access to clean air and clean water, I started to realize that's the least controversial thing that I could say and makes complete sense within the context of environmental advocacy. So over time, once I started saying, like, y'all, people need clean air, like, they started to get it. And I'm talking about basic human needs and rights. And I think especially after 2020, where there was this huge conversation about racial justice, I think a lot more people in the environmental space got it. And not only that, people who were outside of the environmental space started realizing more and more and getting curious about what's going on in their communities and their environment. So yeah, it's definitely, it's been an uphill battle, but I think the time is now.
Well, isn't that interesting though, as you talk about like that moment of realization, like you're advocating for fish, and then you're just like, wait a second, I have people in my own communities that don't have rights as well. Like, that seems to me like such a powerful connection. It totally kind of rings true in my mind. And I like how you say that you had to find the kind of language that people would resonate with. Like, when you say things, you're like, when I mentioned that a lot of people don't have clean air. Oh, anyone can relate to that. Suddenly it's like you were able to find the ways to express the needs for people to understand. So it was in 2020 that you posted this graphic that was just so widely shared across all social media. And I feel like that was kind of a game-changing moment for you. Do you want to share like what that was? And then also, why do you think it connected with so many people?
Yeah, so this was during the summer of 2020. And again, I was thinking about the salmon and then also seeing like hundreds of thousands of people around the world take it to the streets, talking about racial justice. I just felt this kind of fire in me of, okay, I can't ignore this anymore. And I don't think, it honestly felt shameful that so many environmental organizations were not speaking up for what was happening. So I decided to just think about, okay, I'm stuck inside during the pandemic, but I want to protest. So I made a graphic that just said environmentalists for Black Lives Matter, kind of in repeating words, and it also had rainbow lettering. And I think I did that because I thought, regardless of all the trauma of what's happening with my people and so many oppressed people around the world, something that this world can never take away from me is my joy. So that's why a lot of things are very colorful, including the book, even when I'm talking about kind of those, painful topics. And then in that, I also included a pledge for anyone who wanted to be an intersectional environmentalist and advocate for marginalized communities and the environment at the same time. And I couldn't have expected anything would have happened, but it kind of went viral. And I started realizing that a lot of environmental organizations, there were people who felt the same way that I did, but for some reason they thought they needed permission to be able to advocate for these things. And they never needed my permission, but if that post in some ways gave them that check mark and the green light, I'm really glad that it did. And a lot of beautiful things came from that, like my book and the organization that I've been able to create. And a lot of environmental organizations are reworking their mission statements, and that it's just really, really cool to see.
Yeah. Isn't that funny how it's like, I remember in elementary school, teachers would tell us, if you have a question, raise your hand because someone else probably has the same question. But yet I remember that feeling of just being so afraid to feel like I looked dumb or stand out or like I wasn't like everybody else. So oftentimes, you wouldn't raise your hand to ask the question, and then some other kid would ask the question. You're like, oh, I guess I wasn't alone. Like sometimes it just takes, and you were even saying that about the whole salmon situation, or you're like, maybe it is just me. I think we all find ourselves feeling pretty alone, and like the thoughts that we're thinking, if someone else isn't expressing them, that they must only exist within us. And so I just think that's such a testament to like, we all have a chance to say and be that person that makes the difference and allows people permission. And, that's amazing that you were able to step in at that moment, at that time, and at a time when people were like craving activism. They were craving a chance to like find a stance. And so, yeah, it's a really beautiful graphic. Did you make it?
I did. I actually made it in Canva because I'm not really a graphic designer.
Oh, right.
So shout out to Canva.
Canva, that's just the like the little phone app, right?
Yeah, it's like a phone app. You could make little graphics and stuff. So yep.
Well, it's really cool. I like that you put the rainbows in it, because it does add a sense of like lightness instead of it just being like black and white, like, and there's that nice beige in the background. And I don't think until you've tried to graphically design something, I don't think people realize how hard it is to make something simple yet appealing and like pretty. Like it's really hard. So anyways, that's awesome. Did you study graphic design?
Wait, oh, sorry. I kind of missed that part. What was that?
Oh, I said, did you study graphic design at all in your communication stuff?
I didn't, but I wish that I did. If I could go back, I would definitely have a minor in graphic design.
Oh, well, you're really good at it. I can see why you're drawn to it. So before we go further down the environmentalist path, I want to take a slight sidestep. And I want to talk a little bit about systemic racism. It's a real thing. And I say that even though it's very obvious that it's a real thing, I feel like a lot of people still, it's hard for people to accept that it's a real thing. So we could talk about systemic racism a little bit, or let's start out by talking about the word privilege and what does that mean? I would love for you to kind of share.
Yeah, so privilege for some reason, I don't know, everyone has privilege in some way.
Can you hear me? Have I gone quiet?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
You dropped
Let's
off
see.
for a
We
second,
can't
but
hear
you're
you
back
very
now.
well. I can like barely hear you.
Oh no, can you hear
Leah.
me now? Let me see.
Let's
Leah,
see. Fish, can you hear
I
me?
got my headphones. Can you hear me?
Yeah. No, Leah, you sound clear. Linz, I think you might be having just a couple little connection issues.
Oh no. Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah, Leah, we can hear you. I'll touch base with Lindsay.
Okay, I can barely hear you. So keep going. There must be something wrong with my audio, but just keep going.
Okay. Well, to answer the question of what privilege is exactly, I guess the best way to look at it is, so in the United States, just kind of like systems of power, I guess, and who is most represented in different systems of power is really important. So, for example, in the United States, if you're talking about race in particular, and it's not even in accordance with the demographics of people in the United States, but if you look at university professors, if you look at the legal system, if you look at Congress, etc., it's primarily white and male. So if you are more reflected in systems of power, typically the legislation that's passed or certain rules will kind of benefit the majority or who's most reflected. And I think privilege in other areas, as an example, something that I often didn't really think about as an able-bodied person is disability and disability justice. And often privilege is something that is unearned. So it's something that you just don't really think about until it's pointed out to you. But more recently, I've been thinking about accessible buildings and spaces and not realizing that it's a privilege for me to be able to just safely navigate the majority of spaces and buildings that are built for me. But talking to a lot of disability rights advocates, I'm starting to recognize my own privilege in those areas. So yeah, privilege, it's a very broad topic, but they're kind of unearned advantages, often things that you don't really think about that impact your ability to navigate throughout this world.
Yes, thank you. I'm so glad I had you explain that and not myself. And I think that, okay, when I used to hear the word privileged, I had the reaction, the bad reaction that I'm like ashamed that I used to have. I used to think that it meant that it took away from my hard work. Like if people said I, was privileged, it meant in my mind that they were saying I didn't earn what I have and that I had everything handed to me, and that's not what people are saying. And so I've learned, and I'm really grateful for the humility check I had during the whole pandemic and the Black Lives Matter movement. Like I leaned into that discomfort and I realized, oh my gosh, I have been really unaware that first of all, I've been very privileged through my whole life. And that doesn't mean I haven't worked hard. It just means that my upbringing, my history, my race, my body, all these things, they haven't worked against me, which sometimes that is not the case. Like you said, we all are privileged in some way, and realizing that privilege, it doesn't mean that you're a bad person. It doesn't mean you've done something wrong, but it is a chance to recognize that you have these things. And so to look out for people that maybe don't have these same quote privileges that you were just born with and that you didn't earn, like you said. So there is so much resistance a lot of times for those that have privilege when they hear words like that, because I think, like I used to feel, people think it's taking away from what they've done, which it's not. And I don't know, is that a good way of saying it? Is that something you would agree with?
Yeah, I love the way that you describe that, because there can be a lot of defensiveness that comes up with privilege. But I don't know, like there's things that I haven't even thought about, like the fact that both of my parents went to school, that made me, or they went to college, that made my college application process a lot easier. And I'm not saying that I should feel shameful in any ways about that, but understanding that there are people where that's not the case and they're first generation college students and they may have had to go out of their way. So I think it's just really important to consider so we can be more compassionate to other people, especially in the United States. There's really kind of a sentiment of pull yourself up by the bootstraps. Everyone has equal opportunity to do everything, but that's not the case. And it often puts blame on low income people or people from marginalized identities. And I don't want people to feel bad about those sorts of things, because obviously, yeah, there's personal responsibility, but there's also like systems that are at play that are making it a lot harder for people. They can't just pull themselves up by the bootstraps, because if that was the case, then everyone would be incredibly wealthy, etc. Even with me, just reckoning with my own career, a lot of it is just chance, like a chance encounter on social media. And I'm not saying that I didn't work really hard, and I think that I, am talented, but I know there are people who are just as, if not more talented than me, that didn't happen to post a graphic on social media at that time. So it's okay for us to look at certain privileges or things that we had access to, while also, rewarding ourselves, but knowing like, hey, we could be compassionate to other people who are doing the same things and maybe didn't have the same outcome.
I love that. And it's so true. That whole like pick yourselves up by the bootstraps, work hard, American dream mindset, I think is why I didn't understand that I was as privileged as I was, because I watched my parents work really hard. I watched myself do exactly that and then find my dreams. And unlike you, I had my very lucky moments where I did something at the right time and it led to this and it led to this. And, so it's like, yes, it was an example of that quote unquote American dream at work. And so in my mind, if that was possible for me, it was possible for anybody. But then when you start to really take into account that we all live very different lives, we all come from very different backgrounds, and it can be very painful to come to those realizations. But at the same time, I think that's what gives you empathy. That's what makes you a more caring person. And that's what allows you to be like an advocate for change. Once you finally start to go through those kind of painful realizations and feelings, and then come out the other side, that's what allows for change in yourself, and also the change to be able to be like, okay, now I want to have conversations about this. I want to help other people. I want to see what I can do. And so I am curious, now that we've talked a little bit about systemic racism and a little bit about privilege, how and what are the biggest links to how social justice and environmental issues go hand in hand?
Yeah, so the two biggest factors of whether or not someone or a community will experience environmental injustice in the United States are race and income. And oftentimes those things are compounding, and sometimes they're not. So I think that's something also to point out. There's an example in the book where I talk about a middle-class Black neighborhood. And regardless of income, Black communities are more exposed to environmental hazards and injustice. So that's racism. But also those can be compounding. So if there's both of those things, then environmental injustice will happen even more. And then things like median income. There's a really great study by American Forest that looks at tree coverage, and you can look at an area that's really wealthy, and there's often more tree coverage, which means they have more carbon sequestration, or those trees are sucking up pollution, so they have improved air quality. And then if you look at lower income neighborhoods, and not just talking about urban neighborhoods, there's less trees, so there's less carbon sequestration. So there's so many things that could go on and on about how some of these environmental hazards are connected to those two things. So yeah, that kind of just shows how social injustice and environmental injustice intersect, because those same communities are also being impacted by other things, whether it's a need for education reform, criminal justice reform, on and on.
Yes. And like this kind of roots so far back, and how it ties into the systemic racism is the fact that, years and years and years ago, people were segregated. They were put into specific neighborhoods because of the color of their skin. Like, Native Americans were pushed to certain parts of the land because the white people wanted the land. Systemic racism happened because people were literally geographically pushed together and put in an area and said, this is for you. And that doesn't just go away. Like, that doesn't just one generation later, everybody moves out. Like, no, it's like people are tied to the land of their families. And especially if, when it comes to income, the ability to just like go somewhere else and start over isn't there. So I talk a little bit more into that, because I was like, oh my gosh, that really made sense to me, how once upon a time people were put in these places, and, and this effect of that is still here.
Yeah, it makes me, okay, It makes me so angry. I do get mad when people tell me, like, well, why don't
You're
they
so
just move?
calm as you're angry. It makes me so angry. Oh, I need to
so
embody
mad.
that.
I am so mad.
She's so mad right now.
I'm so mad. No, but it makes me so mad when people are like, well, why don't they just move? I'm like, okay,
Yeah.
first and foremost, no one should be living with these hazards. But like you said, structural racism is so important because redlining is something that happened in the United States where literally home mortgage like lenders would circle areas and red pins and say, these are areas that will rent to Black people and these are areas we will rent to white people, etc. So there's generations of cities, and not only that, like cultures that have been built in certain areas. So for example, like Harlem, there are a lot of people in New York that are living there that are Black and brown people that have created culture. They've created music, history, so many things in these areas. So when you say just move, there are, there's a lot of like cultural significance to that in addition to the environmental injustice that's happening. And then that also
family and friends and food, like the things you love. It's a lot to say. Like if someone told me, like, if you don't like LA, just move. It's like, well, but my life is here, my job is here, my family's here, like my friends, like what?
Yeah, you can't just like pick up and move all the time. And then something that I think is really interesting and with this is that, okay, so there's a lot of these historic areas that have been formerly redlined. But then the concept of gentrification is starting to happen. So there are people who might have some level of privilege that are moving into these areas that are still plagued with environmental injustice. And I'm just curious because there's different expectations that happen. Like gentrification, we could go on and on about that. But then they're expecting like, oh, the air quality is bad, or we want community gardens. These are things that we're used to outside of this neighborhood. And I don't know. I don't really know how to approach that because technically the conditions might get better with people moving in, but then they're pushing people out to areas that are even worse. So maybe there could be something that happens there where it's not gentrification, but it's community revitalization with more people who have privilege starting to realize like, oh, this is really messed up, and using their privilege to make the community better for everyone and not just pushing people out. But demographics are changing in a lot of these formerly redlined communities. But like I said, we're seeing that just lead to people being pushed out into worse areas, which isn't a solution at all.
Right. What do you think is something that could be a solution? Like what's something that like people listening could, take into the future as like possibly a way to help?
Supporting local businesses and local organizations is really important, especially when it comes to community revitalization and not gentrification. So if you're bringing new like businesses into certain areas, making sure that you're supporting business owners that are in that area, and that their businesses aren't just getting pushed out, that you're employing people from the local community, because that's also part of community revitalization. And then also supporting the environmental justice organizations that are already there, because chances are there are organizations that are trying to revitalize their community, but they just need resources and support and amplification. So when I moved to Ventura, California, I looked up environmental justice orgs, Ventura, and then I found out they were trying to build an energy plant like 50 feet away from a school. And I was like, what? This is insane. I didn't know this. It's not in the local news. And I went to a protest to, fight that. So I say, look up what's going on in your local community. You might be shocked. You might be shocked about what's happening down the street, and find a way to support those organizations. And I really want to stress the importance of supporting your local economy, supporting local farmers, supporting local artisans. That's the most sustainable thing that you can do. And that will also strengthen your community and communities that are in need of revitalization.
Go to those local farmers markets.
Do it.
I saw the funniest thing. I don't know if you're aware of the Instagram Overheard in LA. Have you heard of that?
I've heard of it, and now I need to follow it.
It's just a funny, like they just post mostly quotes of people like that someone overhears in a grocery store or walking down the street, and they're hilarious. They're such like LA things, and they're really funny. There was one that was actually a picture from a farmer's market, and it was like these eggs that I think they were like $18 a a dozen because the chickens listened to, I think, Led Zeppelin, like while they were laying the eggs. Sorry, I just thought that was so funny. I was like, only in LA, and people were buying them. They're like, these are artistic eggs. But anyways, all farmers markets are not those prices. That was just a funny thing I saw from overheard in LA. Most of the time, I love going to the farmers market. It makes me get a touch of like you said, just feeling like I'm supporting like local community, but also just that feel of like, oh my gosh, I live in a city, but apparently nearby there are farms and there are animals and there are chickens. They can't be too far because I'm seeing their products right here. So when you say search for like stuff in your area, what is like a good search? I wouldn't even know where to start. Like what's something I could type into Google and find something from?
Yeah, you can try environmental justice organizations or even climate justice organizations like in your community. Because I'll point you to the specific things that are addressing not just conservation, but addressing social and environmental justice.
Okay, cool. That's something that's very, okay, anybody can do that. We can all do a Google search and at least see what's there. Because like you said, sometimes it's just about being aware and seeing, just opening your eyes, because sometimes that's enough to make you see, oh my gosh, I want to be a part of this. So very simple and something anyone can do. I also just want to take a real quick pause for a second and just welcome anybody that just came in. Thanks for joining us for our audio room. And if you missed the intro, today we have Leah Thomas with us, who is environmental activist. And she also works a lot with how environmental issues affect social justice and vice versa. And we're having just a really fascinating conversation about how these two overlap. And so thanks for being here, everybody. Thanks for being here, Leah. I want to just kind of go over some of the other things your book mentioned about how social justice and environmental issues do go hand in hand and the crossover there. I thought it was so interesting that you talked about after Hurricane Katrina and the relief efforts, the Black neighborhoods were the most affected because they had probably the weakest infrastructure due to the area they lived in and the facilities that they had. And yet they got the least relief efforts. Most of the relief efforts went to the more gentrified white neighborhoods. And that, and you said that's kind of like a common thing that happens generally with most relief efforts. Is that true?
Unfortunately, yes. Yeah, it is true, unfortunately.
And then you talked about access. Like, I was like, wow, this is a thing in the States. Like, it just shows how ignorant I can be sometimes, that like access to clean water is still something that is like not for everybody. Not everybody has access to clean water. And you talked about how a lot of the reservations where, the Native Americans live, like some of these places, like access to good food and clean water is like a daily issue.
Yeah, and honestly, I think it's because we assume positive intent, or we just take things for granted, and that's a privilege. Like, I know that the water that I drink out of my tap is usually going to be okay, and I would assume that should be the same case for everyone. But then, eventually there's stories like what happened in Flint, Michigan, where people had high concentrations of lead in their water, that I think made me and a lot of other people realize, okay, if this is happening in Flint, where else is this happening where it's not getting the same sort of media support? But yeah, there are people who are fighting for their basic human needs like clean air and water. And it's okay, I think, if people didn't know that before, but if they're listening to this, now they know. And it's so important to take action because everyone should have access to those things.
Right. Exactly. And I'm like, oh my gosh, this happens near me. Like, I grew up in Arizona. There was a lot of reservations like around where I grew up, within hours. So it's just crazy. It was happening pretty much in my backyard as a kid, and people didn't have the same water that I had. You also talked about talk about the landfill situation. I thought this was really interesting and really sad.
Yeah, it is really sad. But there's more toxic waste sites and landfills in a lot of communities of color. And again, that also has to do with like, okay, so during the Earth Day movement of the 60s and 70s, there were a lot of environmental advocates that were trying to get landfills and toxic waste sites out of their neighborhoods. However, that movement wasn't very diverse. So yes, they did see those landfills kind of stop being placed in their neighborhoods, but they were kind of diverted to low income and communities of color. And landfills, there's so many things they could go on, but one, it's the smell, which is terrible. But then they also emit a lot of like carbon emissions and greenhouse gas emissions. And in addition to that, when items are kind of biodegrading in landfills, then that kind of leaches into the soil, and that can also kind of pollute other waterways, like local waterways. So there's a lot of negative impacts of having more landfills in different communities.
Yeah. I thought that was really wild and something I wasn't aware of. It just goes to show how, like you said, there's like asthma issues, like because there's not as many trees, like they don't have the same amount of like carbon consumption by the trees, and they don't have as good of air. And like you said, the smell, it's just so many things that you're like, okay, this really isn't, the two have a huge overlap, social justice and environmental issues. So I'm curious, I want to jump to a slightly different topic now. You previously worked with Patagonia, and this is a company that is known for being really involved in environmental efforts and being eco-conscious. What clothing or fashion companies do you think address this issue well? Because I know that like, you know, fast fashion is such a thing, but do you have any companies that you're like, these are some wonderful companies that create clothing in an eco-friendly way and, you know, don't leave a huge carbon footprint?
Yeah, I would say in addition to Patagonia, my favorite shoe company is Allbirds. So they make shoes really sustainably, and I think that that's really cool. There's also a lot of brands, and some may argue that it's greenwashing, but I want to note that a lot of sustainable and ethically made clothing is more expensive.
Yes.
And that's because they're not using like child labor, and it's more expensive for a good reason oftentimes, but then that's not accessible to most people. But yeah, so there are brands that have like a sustainable collection, and if that's what's most accessible to you, even if it is kind of a bigger company, I feel like that's a step in the right direction. But I also really love Reformation for dresses. They can be a little pricey sometimes. I also really like Christy Dawn for dresses. They use regenerative organic cotton, which I think is really cool. And then some other brands include Everlane, which has more accessible price points. And the last one that I'll name is my favorite jean company. They're called Boyish Jeans, and they make jeans really sustainably.
Okay, I wrote all those down. How do you spell Allbirds?
So Allbirds is ALLBIRDS, and their shoes are so comfortable, and you can just throw them in the washing machine, which is so cool. So you can just wear
amazing!
them, like, forever.
I love that. You know, and it's funny. One thing my mom often reminds me of is, I don't know, like my parents, quote unquote, didn't have a lot of money when I was growing up. I know that like everything's relative, but you know, money was something that like we just did not have a lot of. What are the words? Anyways, we didn't have a lot of money. But my mom always reminds me that like you make room for what's important in your life. And somehow they found a way to cut like we barely had cars that work, yet they found a way to give me violin lessons. And we didn't have a microwave, yet, you know, like they found a way to make sacrifices to do other things. And so oftentimes, like when we see clothing that is, you know, it's eco-friendly, and you know that this company, for example, didn't use child labor or all the different things, but yet then you see the price and you're immediately like, oh, I can't afford that. But the real question is like, well, we all can afford what we decide is important. And if it's important, we will afford it. Like, that's just how life goes. And so I think it is important to like really think about the decision we make on these daily basis, you know, because it's easy to not see what you don't want to see. You know, child labor is such a horrible term, but if you don't think about it, it's not there because you can't see it. I would love for you to talk a little bit about like fast fashion. And like, that's a newer thing, isn't it?
Yeah, unfortunately, it kind of started in the 90s or like the 2000s, and kind of okay, so it started off good. People were trying to make everyone able to access kind of runway looks, I guess, because in the past, like, you know, something would be on the runway and only people with like a lot of money could tap into some of those trends. However, with like MTV and people just getting really excited about creative expression and new styles that they were seeing in music videos, fashion companies decided, okay, how can we get these looks to people as soon as possible so they can feel like they're also, you know, following these different fashion trends, and let's cut the prices tremendously. And that's when we start seeing $5 t-shirts, which at first seems really accessible in terms of people's you know, creative expression. But then you start looking at, okay, why does this t-shirt cost $5 when formerly when it was on the runway, maybe it cost like $50 or something like that? That's really significant. And they're cutting so many corners environmentally and socially to make that shirt $5. So it often means paying people pennies overseas in factories that unfortunately many have collapsed. So it's threatening people's, you know, human their lives. And it often includes slavery and child abuse, which is really, really upsetting and dramatic. And then it also includes dumping toxic dyes into waterways to just produce those items as quickly as possible. So that's what fast fashion is. It's finding ways to get looks from Instagram to consumers as soon as possible. And unfortunately, it's also kind of exploiting the environment and people in the process. But most people don't know about that. They just think it's normal now because we have companies like H&M and Forever 21 for clothing to cost that amount. But yeah, it won't be that low unless people and the planet are exploited in the process. So it's time for change.
Yeah, it's really amazing to think that this is such a newer thing, that, you know, fashion used to be something that was a little more out of necessity. You got new clothes when you needed them. And now it's just like you get new clothes because you just feel like it, and because a fashion trend has started, and because you have to do more Instagram posts, and you've already worn everything in your closet, and heaven forbid we wear the same thing again. And, you know, and it is interesting, like the automatic reaction sometimes when I do, like someone sends me, oh, this is a, you know, a clothing company that, you know, they make their shirts and they pay their employees well in these other countries. And it's like, oh my gosh, like, yeah, $50 for a t-shirt that I could buy for $5. But it comes down to like, it's a bit of a conscience thing that you have to think, I get to make a choice. And also, I think you said that fashion is, am I right, one of the most, like, it leaves the highest carbon footprint of any of the industries. Is that true?
I think it's in the top 4, which is pretty scary. I think it's right under agriculture. I need to double check because I'm sure I put that statistic in the book. But yeah, isn't that scary? Like the way that we make clothing is right under like agriculture and like transportation and the oil and gas industry. It definitely does not get up there.
Yeah, because you obviously think that, like, yeah, like carbon emissions from cars and planes, like that's something people are trying to work on, but it's obvious that gas has to make these giant steel things move and fly. But to think that right underneath that is like the clothing we wear, that's destroying the environment almost just as much, and it's hurting people's lives almost just as much as like the oil fights and everything that goes on there. It's kind of mind-blowing, and it really does make you think about the choices you make when you wear things. And so I'm going to repeat some of these names for anybody listening. And also, Fish, you should come on here. Do you remember that? By the way, Leah, my assistant Fish is on here too. I want you to tell us, Fish, if you can remember, what was that clothing line that Abby told us about? It was a leggings brand. Here, if you can remember it.
Yes, hold on. I can actually go look at the tag in my leggings right now. Give me a second.
Or she's just going to take off her pants. Good call. Yeah. But I'll repeat some of these names that you said. Allbirds was the shoe. You said Reformation was great for dresses. Christy Dawn, Everlane, boyish. You said these were all brands that you thought were really great and sustainable. There's also Patagonia that you used to work for. But I really want
Collective.
to make... Wait, what is it?
Girlfriend Collective.
I love them.
Yeah, I have started exclusively buying my underwear and bras and leggings, all of those from them ever since our one of our tour mates recommended them. Very eco-friendly, and it's worth the money. I'll tell you what, I wear them daily, and no stretching, no ripping. Highly recommend spending the money for them. Absolutely.
Well, remind me again too, Fish. They were recycled, like 100% recycled, right?
Yeah, I looked it up, and I'll have to go back and remind myself of the statistics, but Abby sold me on them by telling me that they are made using ocean plastic, and that their, Girlfriend Collective was environmentally friendly, and they shipped it environmentally friendly, and it showed up in like a paper, bag, and I could just recycle it right then and there. I'm sold on them. Highly recommend.
That's amazing. And I do think we all have so much more power than we think we have. And I know that we're all only one person, but differences are made by one person making a stand. And that's proven over and over and over again through history. And the fact that Leah decided to post something to speak up about, something you felt, and the world reacted. And, we all have the chance to, just through conversation and by doing it, like our friend Abby on tour, being like talking about her leggings and how she loved them, and she would always wear these leggings because they were fully recyclable, and it made both me and Fish ask her more and say, okay, I want to, obviously I was bad and didn't write it down, but I personally have been really inspired by this conversation and reading your book, Leah. So I'm like, I want to make a goal to support, like, to stop being the fashion girl, and one, buy less, and secondly, buy sustainably. And that's going to be something I'm going to stand by. I feel like every year I make a goal of one thing I'm going to do. And I really highly recommend people that are listening to do the same. Like, you can't do it all at once. Just pick one thing for the next few months that you're going to work on, whether that's Googling how to, like, what's going on in your area, whether that's looking at clothing and trying to be more eco-conscious about the clothing decisions you make, or whether it's like, using less plastic. Like, just make one goal. And that is honestly how the world changes, is by individual little goals like that. Fish, also, you had a question that you texted me.
Yeah.
I accidentally deleted it, but how about you go for it? You ask.
It's
sorry.
In my brain. No, this is my favorite topic. I could talk about this for hours. So this has been an absolute treat to, listen to this conversation. But my question is, and I'm going to preface it with an experience of mine. A couple of years ago, I had the privilege of going to Matanuska Glacier up in Alaska. And while I've been what I would consider an environmentally conscious person my whole life, it wasn't until I got to Alaska and I visited this glacier, and I had a local who, lived and worked on this land, apologized to me that there was like a mile worth of mud between where we parked our car and where the glacier started, apologized to me for this mile of mud and said, this wasn't here a few years ago. This is global warming. So I'm sorry that you have to trudge through this mud to get to this glacier. And I was like, why are you apologizing to me? Like, we should be apologizing to you. This is horrible. And at the time I was 30, and it was the first time in my 30 years of life that I saw global warming, that I saw climate change in front of me. And I'd always been a believer, but this was tangible. It was in my hands, and it was heartbreaking. And it's occurred to me, actually, just in this conversation, that most people don't have the privilege of seeing real world examples like that, or seeing, the truth of climate change in front of their eyes in a way that they can't deny. How would you recommend that people who don't have that privilege, or that's not a priority to them, how would you recommend that they make climate change and global warming real in that way? I guess it's one thing to Google, but it's another thing to see it in person in that way.
Yeah, I think one thing is really kind of listening when things are a bit odd. Like the other day, it just started snowing when I was in Pennsylvania. And typically it's not really supposed to be snowing right now. So if there's kind of unusual things that are happening, like suddenly there's a heat wave and then the next week it's freezing, that's something that's kind of been happening all throughout spring. Or if suddenly during the summer you're noticing, it's a lot hotter than usual. This is really odd. Kind of paying attention to those sorts of things, because there are a lot of natural disasters that are happening even more. And I know that natural disasters happen, but it's unnatural that the frequency in which they're happening, like the fires in California and flooding and the rain that we're experiencing, etc. So I would tell people, if you have a hunch that it's not normal, it probably isn't. And I know it's more obvious when you look at a glacier and you can see it melting, and when you look at a lack of snow coverage. But chances are there have been small things that are happening in kind of anyone's community that we should start paying attention to, because those things are only going to increase. Not to be a bit of like a doomist, but those things are only going to increase if we don't take action as soon as possible, because it is starting to impact people and not just the glaciers. And we should start paying attention to the increase in natural disasters, and then just really odd weather occurrences that are happening. That's all a part of climate change.
Yeah, for sure. I almost feel like, no, we should be doomists, because if we aren't, then, we're going to run out of time. And I always encourage people, sure, don't panic, but also, feel some concern.
Yeah, panic a little bit. Yeah, panic a little bit. No, I really appreciate that, and that is such a good visual example, Fish. You've shared that picture with me too, and it's pretty striking. And okay, so you wrote a book and you released it this year. So congratulations on being an author. And is that your first book?
Yeah, this is my first book.
It's awesome. Well, I just finished it on Audible actually this morning. I've been babysitting my nieces, like I said, for the last, few days. And so I've been in between nap times, reading the book and trying to catch it in. But it was really, really eye-opening, and it was beautifully written. And so you've written extensively about a variety of these issues and environmental subjects prior to writing your own book. And so what was it like being able to expand on these ideas in a longer format and kind of at your own creative discretion?
It was really cool, but also kind of frustrating. I didn't realize that I get really into research, which again makes sense. I'm a writer. Yeah, it was during the pandemic. So I had just hours and hours each day just getting lost in the research. And I think it was hard to figure out what I wanted to say. And I had to realize that it was going to be imperfect, which I think was the hardest thing to accept as a writer, that there's so much that I wanted to include, but this is just a primer. So reminding myself, okay, I can write follow-ups, after this. But I really enjoyed kind of including the voices of so many people. So if people are reading the book, or if they're listening to the Audible, I would recommend checking out. There's kind of a toolkit in the back of the book with quotes from about 20 activists from around the world. And I think that was my favorite part, just hearing what intersectional environmentalism means to them, and then action steps that people can take after kind of reading all the information in the book.
Yes, no, that's really cool. I love that you do have at the end of different chapters, you have questions of and little action items to kind of take these really big and daunting topics and make them bite-sized for people. So it's at the end of each chapter, you almost pick one little prompt at the end to be okay, I'm going to think about that today. Even if it's that simple, I'm going to think about that one prompt. How do I feel about that? Or what have I noticed in my area? Or have I done this? Just little things to kind of just be aware. It was the way you outlined it was really nice. And I think it's really cool how I found that sharing ideas, the best way to do it is to for myself, is to come across with slightly a different angle than maybe has been done before. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. You don't have to come up with an entirely new platform for people to listen to, or a totally new type of music. You just kind of have to think about a slightly new lens. What's your perspective? What's your shift you're going to put on it? And I thought this book was really cool because that's exactly what you did. You spoke about environmental issues, but you just put this lens on it of how it affects different demographics of people, and you made it very humanizing. So I thought that was really, really special. And I do want you to talk a little bit about, and I want to be respectful of your time because I know you have to go. So just my last question or last thought, I want you to talk about this new Earth session you are launching. I believe tomorrow you're launching your first episode of this series. So I would love for you to tell us about it.
Yeah, so this makes me excited, and hopefully it makes you excited. But some of our earliest supporters of our nonprofit were musicians and artists, which was unexpected, but also really cool. And there are a lot of musicians who were just like, hey, how can I educate my fan base on intersectional environmentalism? How can I get involved? So from then, I started realizing, like, I want to start creating partnerships with musicians and artists and creatives that want to utilize their platforms to create change, because I want whatever experiences we create as an organization to also be joyful. They can be educational, but I want them to be joyful. So for the last year, we've been working on our new program called Earth Sessions, which is kind of an intimate concert series where we partner with local environmental justice organizations. So we have 2 partners in Brooklyn, and then we work with musicians, and we put on a show where the musicians perform and they activate their fan base, but they also, give some nods to the climate. And in the middle of the 2 sets, we have an educational panel kind of talking about environmental justice. So people get to come, learn, boogie, and then walk away knowing organizations in their own community they can get involved with. So it's really just an experiment of how we can start to rethink environmental education and engaging people through community and joy and fun at the same time. So it's called Earth Sessions, and we're piloting our first show, I guess that's tomorrow, actually, in Brooklyn. So I'm really excited.
Amazing. And is there a place we can listen to this, or is it more all in person?
Yeah, so we will be streaming it on Instagram Live on Intersectional Environmentalist, and then we'll also be capturing video footage of each of the acts in the panel, and we'll start posting those on Instagram and YouTube and our website, Intersectional Environmentalist, shortly after the show.
Amazing. So I'm sure you guys can find it also through Leah's Instagram, which I believe is Green Girl Leah, right?
Yes, that's me.
That's you? Okay. So if you guys are looking at the app right now, you can see her name is Green Girl Leah. So I'm sure you can find her through her Instagram page, but also the Intersectional Environmentalist page. So I'm excited to hear that. It looks like you have some really cool artists that are going to be playing it. I was checking it out. But I just want to say thank you so much for joining us today and for sharing so much information. I do recommend you guys read her book because it was quite insightful, and it just got me back to thinking about all these things that I'm like, you know what? It's time to make a new goal. It's time to make a couple new goals of the things I want to do to make the environment more of a priority in my life. The goals I made before, they're old. Time to make some new ones. So thanks for kind of reinvigorating my mind about this, and just thanks for hanging with us today.
Thank you so much, and enjoy the rest of your Earth Month. Bye, everybody.
Okay. Happy Earth Month. Bye. Okay, well, that was amazing.
That was amazing. Yeah. Wow.
She's so smart. I was trying so hard to sound really intelligent, but it was, I don't know, I do recommend reading her book. It was really fascinating. And especially once it got going, it had the setup had me, but then once she really started to get into it, I was just like, wow, there's like she said, there's a lot of research in there, a lot of statistics that are kind of mind blowing, but but thank you everybody else also for joining us and for hanging. You now get to talk with Fish and I for another half hour, so don't worry, you're still got us. But I also want to start by maybe playing a song. I thought I would do a song by one of the artists. His name is Charlie Berg, and he had some really fun music. It's very old school and classy sounding. I felt very, very highbrow as I was listening to it. So let's give this a listen, and we'll be back to chat more when it's done. I love that. Isn't that just fun and feel good?
That was nice. Yeah.
I know. I like very relaxing as I was listening to it. I've never heard of him before.
Oh, I'm going to pop that on like my morning playlist. Oh, I love it.
I thought the same thing. I was like, I'm really digging this music, and his whole, like, I went to his Spotify and he's got like almost 2 million monthly listeners. I was like, wait, have I never heard of this person?
I'm on board. Consider me a fan.
2,000 or 2,000,001 or 2,000,002 now, like that. But yeah, it was, and he apparently is like, you know, very environmentally conscious, and he's going to be one of her first Earth Day sessions. So I'm like, that's going to be really cool.
Gosh, I love this topic. I could talk for hours. I know we don't have hours, but I love this
I know
topic.
you do. You've really inspired me in this area. Like, and I feel like sometimes I love this topic, but I get very easily distracted in life.
No, you're not alone. This topic is one of those topics that when you start really educating yourself, it is incredibly easy to get incredibly overwhelmed very quickly, to the point where it's just like, I don't care. I'm just going to throw my hands up and keep living my life. You know, it's daunting. For any Game of Thrones fans, I always liken it to, you know, climate change and global warming they're the White Walkers beyond the wall that are coming to destroy everything. But here we are down in, you know, in the kingdoms just bickering with each other over politics that, while they do matter and while they do, you know, people do have their lives affected by the politics, in the end, they don't matter. Because in the end, the White Walkers are still going to come and consume. And it's just, that's how I always try to make it make sense to people who don't quite understand the massiveness of this problem. I've actually been looking at, and you're going to love and hate hearing this, I've been looking at ways to make my house more kind of passively environmentally friendly. And we are planting a bunch of local, I don't want grass. The grass is terrible. Grass is something that should not be growing where you and I live in, you know, a desert climate. So I'm going to rip up all of the grass in my yard and plant some local wild flowers. Yeah.
You know, and I think this is a good thing to talk about. Like we talked about, while Leah was here, just a few ideas of like how, for example, fashion, you know, pulling back your fashion and trying to like waste less, buy more eco-friendly. Like that's a great goal of like, all right, I'm going to be more environmentally conscious when I shop in terms of fashion. Yes. But also like, I think that it would be really great if we just throw out there a few ideas. You can rip up your grass like fish. If you're not ready to do that, then one of the goals I made last year that I'm actually quite proud of myself, probably too proud of myself for how well I did because it was such a small thing. And yet I've given myself way too many pats on the back over this thing. But I made a goal in 2021 to not use disposable water bottles. And
I was just pulling up a rider so I could tell people listening how many we used to use on tour.
Yeah. And yes, and the reason I can say that, like proudly pat on my back, is because, I was the worst offender on, like, touring industries can be so bad for the environment. And
very bad.
So we decided, we cut our riders in general way down because we were wasting so much food every day. So now we barely have any food show up for like our snacks. But also we stopped getting disposable water bottles, and we brought, we all had our own water bottle that we'd refill. And anyways, like if you want to share, Fish, how many water bottles we used to use on the daily?
Yeah, I'm looking for a rider now, but I can tell you from memory, we used to ask for 200 water bottles a day. 200 water bottles a day, most of which, and that's pretty low. I've been a part of some tours that go through twice as many, 3 times as many. And that, when we say 200 a day, that means somebody will open one, take a sip, set it down, and now you have a plastic water bottle. Yeah, that's unmarked, et cetera, et cetera. And it has
they were all over our bus. They were like, we'd have so many water bottles all of our bus that just had like halfway full. And it was just like, guys. Yeah. And it definitely hasn't been easy, but also in my personal life, Fish will tell you, I carry this like jug of water around with me all the time because I don't want to end up in that situation where I'm like, shoot, I forgot my water bottle. Just hand me a water bottle. Like I really took it seriously. And that could be a goal you make. another goal that my brother-in-law inspired me to do was their family went vegetarian for most of the week. I think Fridays was a meat day. So it's not like they went vegetarian. They just chose to eat way less meat as a result of creating less of a carbon footprint. And when I lived with them during the pandemic for like 4 months, I learned recipes from my brother-in-law. I started to cook more, and I realized this is something I can very easily do. And so I'm not vegetarian, but I'm 90% vegetarian. Like occasionally I'll cook meat. But
that is one of the first things that if you talk to an environmentalist or you talk to somebody who's very well educated on this and you ask them, what's the best way that me as somebody who is not prepared to, go 100% green, whatever, what can I do? The first thing they will tell you is just eat half the amount of red meat that you're eating.
Yes.
Just cut it back by half. You don't have to go vegetarian. You don't have to go vegan,
right? But
just cut it back a little bit. And that saves literally metric tons of greenhouse gases. Like the numbers are huge. They're huge.
Right. Huge. And it's literally by just saying, I'm going to eat less meat. And I don't know. I just think that sometimes we get so stuck in like, I'm not vegetarian. Like, it suddenly becomes almost like me versus you or political, but it's like, no. We're just cut back a little bit and you'd be amazed what you as one person can do for the environment.
Actually, on that note, tying it back into what Leah was just discussing, it's an incredibly privileged thing to be able to be like, oh, I'm going to go vegan, I'm going to go vegetarian. That's expensive. It's expensive and it's not obtainable to very large amounts of people who aren't as privileged as those who can. It's not easy to go vegetarian. It's even harder to go vegan, especially.
Right.
I'm sure you'll remember when we went to Memphis. The locals were joking with us. They're like, oh, we've got one vegetarian place. We got one vegan place that's like 4 or 5 miles outside of town. And it was just like, wow, this is not common.
Yes, it's definitely, it also takes an extra thought at first, for sure. It's almost kind of annoying because you're like, oh gosh, what can I make that's a full meal that's going to fill me up and I'm not going to be hungry in 30 minutes. But, there are some like really great, go through TikTok. You'll find so many recipes. Fish and I send each other recipes all the time that are delicious. And like, I've gotten really excited about the fact that like chickpeas, a freaking can of chickpeas is less than a piece of meat. And it's a way that I can fill up and put that kind of a protein into my meal, into my salad that fills me up. And it's not, because you're right. Usually it is very expensive, but it's like, there are also ways. And even though maybe it might take a little more time, it'll take some figuring out, but it's possible. Anyways, but again, these are all just kind of ideas of little ways that I have tried. And I'm a bad offender. I'm a work in progress here. I am not saying that I've figured it out. Like Fish, you constantly inspire me to be better because of the conversations we have and the things that you share with me that you've learned. And I'm like, oh yes, thank you for that reminder that I need to be better. Like, I'm grateful for that.
Really, that makes me so happy to hear. I think it's really important too for people to not get down on themselves when they're not 100%. Like, you were just talking about the chickpeas, and the first thing that popped into my head was, well, we should also have a conversation about how those chickpeas are grown and the water consumption and blah, blah. But you can't go down that rabbit hole because what it turns into is a defeatist, negative feeling that lives in your chest, and it just makes you think there's no way I can win. But it doesn't matter. Doing one thing or two things is better than doing no things. You don't have to do all the things, but as long as you are contributing somewhat to the problem at large, because we always talk about it, and it's important to remind people, the problem with global warming and climate change is not at the consumer level, it's at the corporation level. So yes, recycling is good and clover lawns are good and reducing your meat consumption is good. But don't think that you as an individual are going to solve climate change. Just do your best and educate your neighbor, educate your family. And that's all you can do. In the end, it's how we vote and it's what we buy.
It's what we buy. Exactly. Because it's like, just imagine if the entire US decided that they were going to eat half the amount of meat that they used to eat. Yeah. Suddenly there will be way too much meat. And so people will stop slaughtering and, as many cows. Like, it's just kind of the name of the game. Like, if like supply and demand, if we create the demand, corporations are greedy. They want the money. They will find a way, no matter how unethical, to make that supply because it will make them rich. And so like the little changes that we make by like having conversations with your friends, like that could be another goal of like, you know, okay, this week I'm going to have one conversation with somebody, whether it's a family member, like just talking about the environment and talking about, you know, global warming or whatever it is. Like, I think that's also, we forget how important it is, the conversations that we share with the people we love. Because honestly, like someone standing up on a soapbox and preaching an idea, for example, like me and Fish talking right now, this won't make as much of a difference as someone listening going to their friend and having a conversation about like these cool new eco-friendly pants they bought. Kind of like what happened with us and Abby. That was more effective to me than hearing a podcast talking about it, because my friend was sharing with me something that she loved. And so real change happens really in relationships. They happen person to person. So I think that we forget the power that we have because it's like, oh, I don't have a huge following or I don't have a platform, but that's not where real change is made. Real change is when you guys take it and then talk about it.
Yeah, no, 100%, 100%. I love this conversation. I love it so much. There's so much that the individual can do. And it really just starts with basic research. And, you know, that starts talking person to person. Like Abby buying those leggings sent me down a rabbit hole of what other things can I buy that I buy every day, that I buy every week, that I can buy more sustainably without spending, you know, without completely draining my savings account to do it. And it, you know, Leah brought up a good point. It is more expensive, but I will say, at least in my experience, and you know me, Linz, I am rough on my clothing. Like I am.
You're also cheap as can be.
I am super frugal. I really am.
Frugal, that's a good word. I'm joking because I'm the same way. And so I'm teasing you, but
No. And I know you and I are in trouble when it comes to budgets because we penny pinch like crazy. But I will say, looking at Abby's leggings and seeing that she could testify to like, hey, these are $88 leggings, but this is where they come from. This is why they're green. And this is how long they're going to last you. It's been a year now. I've got 2 pairs of them. They're in perfect condition still. Like it's as if I've never worn them. And I think that is a testament to, if I had spent that $88 on Target leggings, I would have probably spent more than that in the last year, just with how quickly I wreck them. So it's like, yes, you know, you do spend more, but it's an investment. It's an investment into, you know, the environment. It's an investment into having something nice that lasts longer. I think this is, again, going back to Leah, this is a topic that doesn't really get spoken about a lot, where it's very expensive to be poor. It's very expensive to be underprivileged. You know, people have to buy cheap stuff that they replace more often because they are underprivileged, whereas people who make a lot of money can buy the nice things and they don't have to replace them. And in the end, they pay less.
More waste too, because there are way more plastic products and, you know, like plastic silverware and stuff like that are used in lower income areas because, you know, it's expensive to buy the nice stuff. And so not only is it more expensive, but it's also more waste. And so it, you know, that goes into the same conversation as well. But I just can't stop thinking about like the fashion stuff and how like I feel a huge sense of weight and guilt on that, because like I've been a part of fast fashion for years and I'm always like, oh, I need something new to wear for this photo shoot. What could I buy? And, you know, it's one thing to sit there in shame, but it's another thing to think, okay, well, I'm going to do better. Like when I'm buying from Shein, am I really thinking that those clothes are economically made and that, you know, this like $2 bracelet, do I really think that that is made and the people who make it are treated well? Like there's just, it becomes an issue of like, stop being blind and stop deciding you're not going to see something, because we all kind of know it's there. And it just comes into like, bring it into your conscience and really think about the decisions you made. And I'm really going to make a goal about, I'm going to buy less and I'm going to wear it more and I'm going to buy from better places.
Okay, well, 2 things. One, give yourself some credit. You know, we
reuse.
We reuse a lot of costumes. We really do make a mindful choice to look at what we have first before investing in new. Like, we always see what can we reuse before dumping money and time and all of that into something new. And, part of that to me is the frugal bit, but the other part of it is that I do want to breathe. I'm always using the term, I want to breathe new life into these things.
And by the way, our dancers hate us for that. They'll see a costume come back and they go like, are you kidding me? And we're just like, well, see, look, we fixed it. We cleaned it. We sewed it together again and we put a new bow on it. So look, it looks fresh and new. And they're just like, are you kidding me? But it's for these reasons.
And then something else you got to give yourself credit for is, we weren't given the tools that again, another phrase I always use, we weren't given the tools that we needed to know better. So yes, yesterday was the best time to plant a tree, but the second best time to do it is today. So you're learning now that fast fashion sucks, and that's okay.
I love that saying. Yesterday was the best day to plant a tree, but today's the second best day. That's great. I love that.
Exactly. Give yourself credit,
Oh, well, you're so nice. And I probably will still buy some fast fashion for costume's sake because we're usually last minute stuff. But for myself, I'm going to make a goal. Because I asked you guys to make a goal during this of like all the things we're talking about. And I really encourage you to do that. And like I said, talk to your friends about it. But for myself, I think that's going to be my goal. This year, I'm going to avoid fast fashion for my own personal life.
I love that. I mean, we live in the kind of city where we have endless access to handmade stuff that people make, sustainably, that like using the word privilege, we are privileged to have close and easy access to sustainable fashion. So there you go, harness that.
Another thought was something that I've started to think about as I grocery shop is packaging. I used to never think about that. But now I like kind of subconsciously will like look at the options, and I usually will try to choose the one with the best sustainable packaging that's not full of extra boxes and full of extra plastic. And I had a friend who brought this up to me recently who was saying she and her family did a month where they did a no waste month, and they were only allowed so hard. I was like, wow. So I took that as a grain of salt to be like, okay, I'm going to try to be more conscious and buy the better option. Yeah. But they literally, for an entire month, if it wasn't cardboard, because they would burn stuff like after they used it, if it was cardboard or paper, they could burn it and they would have a little bonfire at the end of every week. But plastic was a no-go. And so they had to really work hard. And I was like, dang, good for you. But I know sometimes people do that. And that's amazing.
A big one that was you've seen the trunk of my car with the reusable bags. One for me was going to the grocery store and putting your vegetables in those plastic bags. I realized there was one day I was at the store and I was putting my veggies in those plastic little baggies, and I thought, my gosh, I am using dozens of these every time I go to the store. So I got online and I bought a couple to start with, and now I've started to crochet my own.
Stop.
Yeah,
I'm dead. Why is this not surprising? See, if I saw you at the grocery store, I would like kind of stare for a second, and then I'd have to be like, I need to go like talk to this woman. I need to understand her mind. Like, I would find you fascinating, but I would also that's so cool.
Yeah, and I feel like there's a moment where I feel silly as I put my veggies in them, and then I'm like, no, who cares? Who cares?
You should be proud of that. I'm not nearly as cool as you, but I would say I remember, I'm going to say 60% of the time to grab my grocery bags, like my reusable ones. And I'm that weird person that like, oh my gosh, they hate me when I go to the checkout because I have all my vegetables in my own reusable bags that aren't individually bagged. And so I'm like piling on, here's the bananas, like here's the, you know what I mean? They're not individually bagged and they probably hate me, but
oh gosh.
How do I buy these crocheted bags?
I'll just start crocheting you some.
Okay, guys, look for Fish's Etsy site coming soon. Crocheted reusable produce bags.
Hey, we should also note you just bought an eco-friendly car. You have the option to buy something cheaper. Oh. You spent more money because you wanted to get an eco-friendly car, and that's a big thing. That is a big thing.
Well, thank you. You're making me feel like I'm not doing so bad.
We need to take
we can
our
all do
wins where we can
better.
get them.
Yeah, we can all do better, but it's important. So because like you were saying before, this is such a big topic and it's so overwhelming that the
Very
easiest thing to do is throw your hands in the air and literally walk away and be like, I can't even look. I'm not going to look anymore because I'd rather just not know.
The guilt is all consuming, and you can't let that touch you. You can't let the guilt set in. You just have to say, okay, I'm going to try A, B, and C, and we'll see what sticks. And just doing one of those is you're doing your part. You're doing good. Yeah.
Yeah, 100%. I think that's the biggest takeaway for me from this conversation is just start doing something. And that's with anything in life. Like, anytime you approach a goal of any kind, it's always overwhelming and it's easier to be like, I'm not even going to try. Like, I'd rather not even try than fail. But like, if that was the case, we'd all be still sitting in diapers as 35-year-old women, like being afraid to take a step. I'm here with my nieces and nephews and watching them try new things and watching my nephew toddle around the house and he falls over and he just gets right back up. And like, that's the important mindset. That's the growth mindset that like I want to hang on to for the rest of my life, is this idea of like, okay, I'm going to take a step. I might fall, but I'm going somewhere. At least I'm trying.
And I would argue that more important than physically doing things more important than cutting out meat, more important than getting reusable bags, more important than any of that is one, just educating yourself, like taking the time to read and to like look at your sources and like be critical and educate yourself, but then two, educate others. That I think is more important than actually physically doing the things, because it starts there. So planting those seeds and planting them well and intelligently and like critically thinking about it is the first step before actually having actionable things.
That's a really good point, because that's what will make you do the other things. And that's what will make them actually stick. If you're just doing it out of pure like, oh, someone said to do this and I feel guilty, then it's not the kind of change that's going to stick. And it's not the kind of change that's real. But if you're like kind of, preaching the gospel about it, and if you are out there researching it and really seeing the impact, that's when your heart will change. And that's when you're actually going to do the things. So that's a really good point.
Yeah. Oh, I love this topic. I would love to continue to touch on it down the road.
Let's keep talking about it. I was really excited for this conversation because one, again, this is such an important topic that we think a lot about in our conversations. And, but also I remember when the Black Lives Matter movement happened, I was like, I don't want to just like feel this now and never talk about it again. And I could do a much better job of, again, it's like, okay, I'm not going to be too hard on myself, but I'm going to remember I want to do a better job of talking about social injustice and these topics on a little bit more regular basis, because I don't know, they sunk in really deep when all of that went down. And I was like, I don't want to be that person that feels it and then just decides to forget, So
yeah, 100%.
I'm grateful for all of you for listening in and for joining us today. I'm sorry we didn't get to we didn't even play a second song. I am the worst radio host in the world. I think that's what this is supposed to be. I'm supposed to play music and chat, and I keep forgetting to play the music, and I'm a musician. Okay, promise, guys. Next time I'll play more music. And next week it's going to be me and Fish again. And I think we're going to have a surprise guest. Wait, who are we talking about that we wanted to have next week?
We were pitching Mark.
We were talking about possibly having one of my producers come on, but I think we're going to save that one because he's great. We want to put that closer to when my album comes out so we can talk. Like, I don't want to give away the secrets, but so I think next week we might, maybe we could reach out and see if Allison is around.
Yeah.
Yeah, Allison is awesome. She's a makeup artist and she's amazing and she's just so fantastic. And we've had some really cool talks about like gratitude. And so maybe we'll see if Allison can come on. But regardless, keep following me on my stories. I'll be updating you guys as to like who's going to come on. And next week it'll be at the regular time, which is 5:00 Pacific. So until then, hang in there, make a goal, just one goal, and we'll talk to you next week. Okay.
Bye.
Yay! Bye.